Assalamu alaikum. My name is Muhammad Abdullah. On behalf of the World Council of Muslims for Interfaith Relations, Stand with Dignity and IslamiCity, I welcome all of you to this first episode of Muharram, a time of sacrifice and personal reformation. This will be a 10-part series where we will be covering various topics which I will go over with all of you. We are all involved in various interfaith activities, but we feel that there is not enough emphasis on intra-faith activities. And really, we cannot do justice to interfaith unless we have a very sincere effort in making sure that we have intra-faith also, and making sure we are working together on issues that matter to all of us. We hope that this series will be a template for interfaith work on issues we face as one humanity. We are honored to have with us two esteemed hosts who have dedicated their lives to promoting a better understanding of Islam. They will be hosting these 10 sessions that we'll be going through. With Walji, he comes from the Shia tradition. He is an educator, humanitarian, filmmaker, author who has penned over 20 books on nutrition and natural medicine. And along with him, we have Dr. Aslam Abdullah, who comes from the Sunni tradition. He has a doctorate in communications from the University of London in England, and he is a resident scholar here at IslamiCity. I will hand this over to them, and they will be conducting this series from here on, and we hope to be learning from both of our scholars here and the guests that will be coming. So with that, welcome to all of you. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Hasnain Walji and Dr. Aslam Abdullah. Dr. Aslam, I think you're muted.
Thank you very much, Brother Abdul Ali. Thank you, IslamiCity. Thank you, WCMIR, and thank you, Stand with Dignity, for coming together to host this important event that would last for the next 10 days. Muharram is a month of great significance, not only for Muslims, but for the entire humanity and the world, if we look at it from that perspective. Because it is a month when one of us wrote a new chapter in the history of humanity. And this chapter was not written with the ink, it was written with the blood. It was a chapter that changed the paradigm of the human relationship. And it was a chapter that added a new dimension to the word sacrifice and the concept of sacrifice that has always been there in our world. And certainly, Dr. Walji will talk more about that chapter. But needless to say that the sacrifice has been an essential component of human sociology and psychology. If you reflect deeply, you would find that each of one of us is the product of sacrifice. We would not have been in this world without the sacrifice of our parents, specifically our mother, to whom we owe our existence. It is she who gave the utmost sacrifice in terms of carrying us in her womb and then making sure that we survive, making sure that we nurture, making sure that we grow up, and making sure that we learn the basics of humanity from her at her own life, at the risk of her own personality, at the risk of her own identity. But when we look at the sacrifice, we see that almost in every aspect of life, whether it is a family or it is community, it is society, it is the country, it is the ethnicity, the concept of sacrifice is always at play. Even in our own personal life, we sacrifice in order to attain a better personality, in order to attain a better identity. But when we look at the definition of sacrifice, we see a very interesting definition coming from those who have tried to elaborate this one. They usually associate sacrifice with offerings to God, whether it is the offering of humans or offering of possessions. And you would be surprised to know that for the last 5,000 years, humans have been sacrificing fellow humans in order to please God or in order to earn better status in the eyes of God. There were at least 25 cultures in the world. Mayong in China, and the Maya in the Native America, and then in Tibet, in India, and in Mesopotamia, and other places. Even in the biblical writings, you would find the reference to human sacrifice that were offered to God. Yes, it was declared unconstitutional and unlawful only in the last century. Even then, the human sacrifice practice did not stop, because we see that as recent as 2020, there were at least 5 recorded human sacrifices in different parts of the world. As late as 1987, we find that in India, the women were forced to throw themselves on the pyres of their husbands as part of the sacrifice that their traditions asked them to do. But now it is considered murder. So that concept of sacrifice has been there. And people have been offering their sacrifices for the causes they believe in. Most of these causes are related to their own ethnicity, their own culture, their own nationality, their own what you call identities. It doesn't matter whether those who were sacrificing were Muslims or non-Muslims, or those who basically were the one who caused these sacrifices were Muslims or non-Muslims. The fact is that every group believed in offering one's own life or one's own positions for the sake of one's identity and one's ethnicity. And it is in this particular context we see that the new chapter that was written in this month of Muharram, some 1400 years ago, was a new idea, a new concept. A concept that revolves around the fundamental ideas that the life is important and sacred. But there come a moment in one's life when one's life is not or does not get precedence over one's own goals and one's own principles. In other words, life is important, but the goal of life become more important than one's life in certain moment of history. And that is what we are talking about, the new chapter that was written in Muharram. Dr. Walji will talk about it. So we look at that perspective not only from the perspective of Islam or from the perspective of Muslims or from the perspective of the Shias or the Sunnis, but we look at it from the perspective of a new dimension in human epistemology, a human endeavor to stand for certain principles that are everlasting and that would be everlasting, and that would not only benefit one group and one set of people, one ethnicity, one community, but the entire humanity as a whole. It is a different thing that we basically have confined it to a particular sect or a particular religious group or a particular community, but the reality is that that sacrifice encompasses the humanity and constantly gives inspiration to the people that yes, the life is sacred and important, but there comes a moment in the life of one when the principles and the goals of life become more important. It is in that particular context that we start this month of Muharram. We realize that this is also the month which the Muslims begin their calendar, Hijrah. And Hijrah is also a kind of sacrifice. Hijrah also is a movement for reformation. Hijrah is also a movement for sacrifice. But the sacrifice that was offered by none other than the grandson of the Prophet ﷺ is perhaps the most unique and most remarkable event in human history. And sooner or later, the world would realize the importance of that as we are becoming a global community, as we are beginning to basically challenge the old definitions of the word sacrifice and then include in that definition a new idiom that the a conscious decision can be taken by individuals to stand for principles regardless of the consequences and regardless of the outcome of that struggle. So we hope that the series that we have would highlight the essence of that sacrifice, because we believe that the sacrifice is the essence of life. But we have to be very clear as to what we mean by sacrifice and how we proceed on the footprints of those who have basically embarked on that path. With that, I hand over the mic to Dr. Walji to carry the discussion at a further level, and then we will, inshallah, have a discussion around these ideas that we are discussing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aslam, and thank you, IslamiCity and Stand with Dignity and the World Council for making this opportunity for us to come together and discuss this very important subject. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين Sayyidina wa Nabiyyina Abul Qasim Muhammad. As we were getting ready to begin this session, somebody forwards me this message from the White House. And I thought it's worth sharing as we begin this. This is a message of President Biden. He says, Jill and I extend our warm wishes to all those observing the Islamic New Year and remembering the historical sacrifices during the holy month of Muharram. We join you in honoring the universal values of justice, equality, and compassion. The reason I thought I would share this with you is not only that it's remarkable and perhaps first time in the history of the United States that a message of this nature has come from the White House, and we welcome it. At the same time, I think it shows the understanding, the empathy, and the sensitivity of the leadership of this country, because President Biden used the word observe and not celebrate the new year. And I think that speaks volume for the significance of the event that we have gathered together to commemorate and to remember. So with that said, thank you, Dr. Aslam, for really delving into the subject, which has made my task much easier. And if I were to sum up the entire ethos and the essence of sacrifice, it would be summed up with this blessed verse of the Quran, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, لَن تَنَالُوا الْبِرَّ حَتَّى تُنْفِقُوا مِمَّا تُحِبُّونَ, that never shall you achieve righteousness unless you give something out of that which you love. And Muharram, as it begins in the 10th of Muharram, is, as Dr. Aslam mentioned, is indeed a paradigm shift in the understanding of the very word sacrifice. And hence, when we were discussing this series, we said, let us set the groundwork and the basic understanding of the very word sacrifice. What does this word mean? You know, it's a heavy word, it's a lofty word, it's an easy word to pronounce, it's a very difficult word to implement. In the wider sense, to add to what Dr. Aslam has said rightly, sacrifice means giving up things which are valued or desired. Now, those things may be tangible, countable, like time, wealth, or it could be life, or intangible and immeasurable, like one's feelings, one's attitudes, one's opinions, one's aspirations, and even the ultimate, one's ego, the I, that needs to be sacrificed in order to achieve a loftier goal. All these are given up for the sake of something that is more worthy or more important, as rightly hinted by Dr. Aslam. So that reminds me of a quote from Jim Elliot, a missionary, and he said, and I quote, that he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. I'll repeat, he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. Worth pondering about, because this is the mentality and the psyche of somebody who is willing to sacrifice, because they realize the importance. It is also important to bear in mind that though, as again Dr. Aslam mentioned, that the very word sacrifice conjures up or has a connotation which is limited to the slaughter of animals as offerings to God and hence surrender to God of some possession. But that obviously is an incomplete or perhaps a misunderstanding. It may be difficult to find within the Quranic vocabulary, and we have scholars of the Quran and Dr. Aslam who may be able to shed more light on this. But it's difficult to find the Quranic vocabulary in exactly having an equivalent word for sacrifice, which also has a wide literary usage. Perhaps nearest in the meaning in the Holy Quran is nusuk, when we say, "Qul inna salata wa nusuki wa mahyaya wa mamati lillahi rabbil alameen," that say that my prayer, my nusuk, my sacrifice, or my giving, my living and dying all belong to Allah, the Lord of the all worlds. Surah Al-An'am, ayat number 162. So the deeper essence is that along with salat, giving suffices to support, encompass, and symbolize a life that is based on a premise that something that is given away includes everything that a person has, whether it be something tangible or intangible. And this value of sacrifice, like it was mentioned in terms of the sacrifice of the parents and the mother, for example, that without sacrifice, life would be devoid of peace, harmony, cooperation. It would be full of conflict and discord, a prey to self-centeredness and the immediate gratification of desires. In a society where you have more takers, there are more people who want to take something, Unless people want to give, there is strife in that society. In a society where there are more people who are willing to give and less people who are willing to take, that's a society which is a peaceful society. Therefore, neither families nor communities can exist or achieve cohesiveness and strength without some sacrifice on the part of each other and the members of that society, and that no human endeavor can succeed in reaching its goal unless one sacrifices things valued or desired. And one of the most effective paths of sacrifice is when that path is taken personally to reach spiritual and moral heights. And I do not need to explain to this learned audience that we have in terms of the personal sacrifices of spiritual and moral heights that we need to attain, and the ibadat that we do, the good deeds that we do on a personal level are all part and parcel of that. But at the same time, to strive for justice and peace in a society is that we need also to make those sacrifices at a societal level. And it really becomes so very effective that when these two paths come together, the personal path and the societal path, then there is true peace and harmony. Allow me to elaborate that firstly, on a personal basis, the sense of sacrifice strengthens our inner spiritual and moral resources, and they develop those qualities of character which are essential to our struggle at every level. Secondly, it develops and reinforces cohesion and discipline, giving the strength and resources to make up for a better society at a wider universal level. And that truly is the underlying message of sacrifice, which is epitomized during the whole tragedy of Karbala as we know it. Every act of sacrifice nourishes and increases one's iman, for it transforms a verbal confession and a mental conviction into a living reality. As I would say that now is a time that you just don't talk the talk, but you actually walk the talk. The process is mutually interactive. The stronger the faith, the greater the capacity to sacrifice. The greater the sacrifice, the deeper the faith, and collectively, the greater the impact on a society. And therefore, the idea of sacrifice and change in society go hand in hand. Without that, it would be difficult. And the next subject that we are going to have, inshallah, tomorrow is actually going to be on reform and on change, and we'll elaborate. But in the final analysis, every sacrifice is a sacrifice of our love or value. When we give away money, life, familial tie, for the sake of Allah, for the sake of a bigger cause, what we in reality give up and make that sacrifice is our love for money, for life, or a relative, not the object itself. So, quickly to conclude that some areas of daily sacrifices are time. It's our most precious commodity. And spending our time to seek the pleasure of Allah is one thing, but just to seek the pleasure of earning money and worldly possessions is truly to shortchange ourselves. And time is indeed the first thing that Allah demands of us. If we reflect more deeply, we know that the time is one thing we cannot hold onto even for a moment. A second passes, a second gone. Time will melt away, and what one earns will indeed stay forever and for eternity. And then the next one, that when we look at time, beyond time, is really the value of life. That a time may come when you'll be required to sacrifice, your life for the sake of Allah. To so lay down your life is the highest act of doing that sacrifice, as it is called, of doing that shahada, and one deserves to be called a shaheed, because life is one's most precious possession. You can only have the courage to die in the way of Allah As soon as you realize that life does not belong to you, but to him, and you must render to him what is his due. We must also remember that death, with that, you can never escape or avoid, that it will always come to you at the appointed hour and place and in the appointed manner. I will stop here, inshallah. We'll continue with the essence of that particular narrative of what happened in Karbala and how does it impact the level of sacrifice. So with that, I will hand this back to Dr. Aslam to continue.
Dr. Walji, you rightly pointed out that the word sacrifice does not fully elaborate the Quranic perspective on that concept and that idea. It is primarily a Latin word, and it means priestly performing or performance for giving to God. So it is mainly, a concept that emerged in the seminaries of the church within the context of Christianity. But the Muslims sometimes use the word qurbani. In Arabic, they use this word, even though it was a Hebrew word, korban, and many of the cultures that were influenced by Hebrew adopted that. And in Arabic, it probably would mean that getting closer to God Almighty. But the Quranic concept is much bigger than that, and that is that the essence of life is built on this concept of giving your own priorities, giving your own interest for the sake of larger interest, and the larger interests are not just your community or your ethnicity or your culture or your race, but the humanity as a whole. And that is the concept that emerged. That's why when the Quran says, وَمَا لَكُمْ لَا تُقَاتِلُونَ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ وَالْمُسْتَضَعْفِينَ مِنَ الرِّجَالِ وَالنِّسَاءِ وَالْوِلْدَانِ الَّذِينَ يَقُولُونَ رَبَّنَا أَخْرِجْنَا مِنْ هَذِهِ الْقَرْيَةِ الظَّالِمِ أَهْلُهَا وَاجْعَل لَّنَا مِن لَّدُنكَ وَلِيًّا وَاجْعَل لَّنَا مِن لَّدُنكَ نَصِيرًا. And how come you do not struggle, you do not fight for the cause of those people who have been oppressed, those people who have been denied their rights, those men, those women who have been living under the torture and the tyranny of people, and who basically have been saying loudly or silently that God Almighty sent someone who could take us out of that kind of situation. So the Quran is basically giving a different dimension and different perspective to that whole concept of living for others. And it is basically extolling the idea that living for others and ensuring that the interests of all human beings are secured is a larger principle and a larger goal that one must achieve and must work for that, because that is the true message and the true guidance that comes from God, that in order to attain the closeness to God, in order to attain his favors, one has to be willing to work for the rest of humanity. And that is a paradigm shift in the Quranic concept. And that was something that was lived, and that something that was shown to the people, that it is possible that the Quran is not merely words, but it is also a practice that has been proven by the acts of those who understood that message very clearly and very definitely.
So thank you, Dr. Aslam. That brings me on to this point, and this is something worth discussing with your erudition. The whole concept of the greater good within the context of the Quranic worldview, that it is not just for one's tribe, it is not just for one's ethnicity, that you sacrifice, or that you are here to serve humanity as part of that, hukukul ibad that we talk about. So help us understand a little bit more in terms of the concept of the greater God, which is a natural phenomena that instinctively lives within every creature, even animals.
In fact, I mean, we go back again to the Quran, which says very clearly, كان الناس أمة واحدة فبعث الله النبيين ومبشرين ومنذرين وأنزل معهم الكتاب والحكمة ليحكموا بين الناس فيما اختلفوا فيه. That human beings have been differing and have their own concept, their own interests, their own ethnic, cultural, geographical interests. But humanity is one. And the message of all the messengers has been to unite that humanity. And how can we unite the humanity if we do not identify with the common good of all? And what is the common good for all? The common good for all is that the societies and the human beings live free from injustices and free from oppression, that they are given the full opportunities to exercise their personality the way God created them in the best possible manner. And that would happen when the tyranny is taken care of. That would happen when we all embrace each other. And that is what the common good is being described, that the interests of humanity are one. You cannot say that the interests of Americans or the interests of Indians or the Pakistanis or the Somalians are different than the rest of the humanity. Culturally and geographically, you can make that kind of argument. That we have a bigger stake on this particular land or that particular resources that God has created. But God is giving us a different perspective altogether, that our fates are tied with each other.
Indeed.
And if one is suffering, the entire humanity is suffering.
Absolutely.
And the biggest suffering comes when the justice is denied. Because injustice basically dehumanizes. Injustice basically says that you are not worth living. Injustice says that you are not equal in the eyes of God. We are the one who would decide and determine how you should live and how you should behave and how you should be subservient to others. And that is what the common good and common interest is. And that's what brings the universality of Islam. Islam claims itself to be universal in that particular context, that one has to look for the common good of all. And as the Quran says very clearly, that وَإِمَّا مَا يَمْكُسُ النَّاسُ وَإِمَّا مَا يَنْفَعُ النَّاسِ فَيَمْكُسُ فِي الْأَرْضِ. Whatever is not relevant and useful for humanity will not stay. Very clearly, Quran is making that kind of thing, that if you have to follow the divine guidance, then you have to identify with common good of all. Without that common good, your claim for a universal Islam and for your claim for a universal divine guidance makes no sense, because then we would become like any other sect, we would become like any other group, any other faction, who are basically concerned only of our interests and only of our own identity. While the Quran is saying that your real identity is to find the common good for all human beings and strive for those common goods. And when it comes, the occasion where you have to sacrifice your life also for that common good of humanity, don't be hesitant. Don't take the life of others, but be willing to offer yourself. And that is, I think, one of the noblest concepts that you would see. And that's why it was a paradigm shift in that context.
Indeed. And if the world had forgotten that interconnectedness that you talked about, the universal interconnectedness, then I think COVID has come to remind us.
Indeed, you are absolutely right.
In terms of how, we are impacted. And the same thing with justice, as has been said, that, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. I believe Martin Luther King said that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look at the Second World War. 53 million people were killed all over the world. Look in the wars that have taken place in the last 30 years. You would find at least 15 million people have been killed. For what?
Indeed.
I mean, why life has become so cheap in that sense? It has become so cheap because that common good is not the common sense for human beings anymore, at least for those who are the power elites who control power. And it is in that particular context, I think Muharram has a special significance, even though we somehow have neglected its universal message. We have confined itself either to the Muslim community or to a particular faction of the Muslim community, but it is a universal paradigm that one has to look at it from that perspective.
Indeed, and it is really a continuation of the examples of heroic sacrifices and martyrdom which abounds in both ancient and contemporary society. In the ancient times, as we know, the torture and death in the affirmation of a noble ideal earned many of them what we call the honor of martyrs. They were killed for their ideas, and their example and the ideal of that total indifference to passions and worldly life provided a model for humanity in all eras. There have been those martyrs. In fact, the very term martyr is used in the New Testament, as you alluded to, actually also means a witness, and so it does a shaheed within the Islamic culture as to the transplantation of those terms. That a martyr, or somebody who has sacrificed his life or her life, is a witness not just to an idea but to an event. For example, in terms of the Christianity, they were witness to an event which was a faith in the crucifixion of Christ, for example. In Christianity, as we know, that martyrdom was another struggle before Christendom became the world power under, say, Constantine. Or in Islam, the jihad or the struggle, and again, the word jihad needs to be kind of elaborated, and I hope you will do that, that the struggle for martyrs was instituted after Islam became a religious, social, and a political order. So there are these connotations where we need to understand where there is Judaism, the whole idea of martyrdom within Judaism are also. So each faith has got, its own set of martyrs in the history of humanity.
You see, what basically makes the Muharram and the events in Karbala different from the rest of the things is worth noticing. While in the ancient cultures and even in not that far past cultures, we see that the communities rise for their rights. They basically focus more on their ethnic, cultural, or even religious rights and all those things. But here we find that certain principles that are common and that work for the common good of humanity were being stressed and emphasized upon. Here we find that, in a culture of power elites that has given that kind of idea that the rulers are Zil-e-Ilahi, or the shadows of God, and who are basically the vicegerent of God on earth in terms of the power structure is concerned, were being challenged by someone who was trained by none other than the Prophet himself, and who took it upon himself to make that statement with his blood and with his family's blood, that yes, the life is sacred and one must respect that life. But then when it comes to the common good of all, then the life is worth sacrificing. And I think this is a bold and conscious decision that word has not yet grasped its totality, because it's beyond ordinary human imagination. That can we stand up for the entire humanity, even for those people who are not part of our generations, even for those who are not part of culture, even for those who are not part of our ethnicities? Can we stand for all of them? This is, this may sound a modern idea, but in fact it is as ancient as the events at Karbala.
Yeah, and indeed, timely and right that as we begin this series in the remembrance of this great sacrifice of Imam Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet, the special status in Muslim history, as you say, has largely been due to his sacrifice and the examples of his courage, sincerity, steadfastness, dignity, and his struggle. And you rightly say that sometimes it's been confined by us, within the four walls of where we commemorate this tragedy, rather than it being, a social justice movement or something that inspires a social justice movement. Because his struggle and the eventual martyrdom became a source of strength and endurance for the oppressed, wherever they were in terms of suffering, persecution, and many have been inspired, within that. In fact, it's been said by numerous authors to say, for example, Antoine Barra says that no battle in the modern and past history of mankind has earned more sympathy and admiration, as well as provided more lessons than the martyrdom of Hussein at the Battle of Karbala. So you're absolutely right when you say that this needs to be internationalized, it needs to be globalized, because sometimes we need to sit back, take a moment to reflect on that monumental moment where over, almost 1400 years ago, when this man stands on a sand dune in Karbala in Iraq, blood was flowing from his body, from the wounds that he had suffered, having lost every one of his family, including his infant child. And then he turns in four different directions, it is said. And he said, Hal min nasin yansurna, is there anyone who will respond to our call for help? Who was he calling out? And I believe that it is a call for generations of all ages to respond
Indeed.
to that call.
Yeah. I mean, if we look at our current history, we find at least 5 or 6 movements where people have sacrificed immensely, like Gandhi's movement in India, or Martin Luther King's movement in the United States for the rights of primarily blacks, for their dignity and all those things, or Che Guevara's movement, or Ho Chi Minh's movement, and all those, or or even in the context, even though he's, people call him communist, Mao Zedong's movement for the liberation of China from the clutches of the power elites. But you find in all these elements, the narrowness of the movement itself, for a particular race, for a particular ethnicity, for a particular culture, for a particular geographical unit. But here in this particular context, we see, that as you quoted him in Arabic, that where are the people? What people he's talking about? Is he talking about a particular tribe? Is he talking about a particular race? No, he's talking about people in general. And he is basically referring to the fundamental ideas that human dignity is the divinely given right to every human being, and the freedom is the essence of life, and justice is what one should strive for, regardless of who the perpetrators are, regardless who the victims are. And that is a message that brings Islam back to its universal message, and that basically reminds people that Islam is more than what we Muslims have been practicing for some time, have been saying for some time, that it's a divine call for the common good of humanity as a whole.
True. Yeah, reminds me of the continuity where Allama Iqbal says, "Sidke Khalil bhi hai ishq, Sabre Hussein bhi hai ishq, Mari ke wujud mein Badro Hunain bhi hai ishq." That the veracity of Prophet Ibrahim's was love, so too is the patient perseverance of Imam Hussein was love. And just as the Prophet's selfless struggle at Badr and Hunain, was love for Allah, truth, and justice. So this truly embodies that entire essence of continuity from the very first sacrifices that were made by the prophets until Hussein. So this is.
And you brought it out rightly that even the Quranic reference to the history of all the prophets refer to that particular concept. And not only the Quranic concept, but I think the biblical reference to the sacrifices of many prophets, as mentioned there, were for that particular causes and all those things, even though Christianity has taken it to a different level by declaring Isa alayhi salatu wasalam as the one who ultimately sacrifices his own self for mitigating the sins of all others. But I think in general, the Quranic message and the message of the Abrahamic faith is very clear in that particular context, that humanity is worth living for and common good is worth working for. So I think that gives us a basic understanding of what why we are talking about this sacrifice, because it is the essence of our life, and we all have been sacrificing in one way or the other within our own limited circles. What this Muharram is reminding us that enlarge your circles, include humanity as a whole. And when you will include humanity, you would find, a different dimension and different paradigm in living your life, because then it would be a life that would give nourishment and that would give life to many who have been the victims of all that basically have denied them their dignity.
True, and all the messengers, all the prophets were charged with this responsibility that you be witnesses unto mankind. And this is something that comes to the fore, that the word witness, the word shaheed, have that connotation to be able to have that, because to really bring this to a conclusion, to say sacrifice is at the heart of every leadership. And Imam Hussain provided that level of leadership that, for example, be it even here, we on Memorial Day, like, we honor, those who sacrifice in the field of battle, whatever it is. Leaders who are true leaders are well aware of the need to sacrifice, and the decisions the leaders face almost always include some measure of giving up. Sometimes, they give of themselves. And Imam Hussain was that ultimate.
Even if you're absolutely right, even if you look at our world today, when we look at our own countries that are Muslim majority countries, or our own organizations, we find that the people have focused on their narrow interests, their organizations, their parties, their perspective, rather than looking at the humanity at large, rather than looking at the common good of all people. Because without the good of all, none of us would be good. But how could I justify, good for me when my neighbor is not good? So I think this is where basically we need, and in that particular context, to conclude with the discussion, because we are approaching the time, is to see how we in the United States and in this country and in this world at this particular moment, in this particular specific period of time, use those concepts of sacrifice to make the common good a motive for all of us and a living reality for the people at large, not only for ourselves, but for humanity at large. And I think that is the challenge that we all face.
Well said, Dr. Aslam, because without making those sacrifices, the revival of humanity or Islam will always remain a matter of speeches and a matter of dreams. To actualize it, we do have to make those sacrifices.
And this definitely would lead us into the second segment of this discussion that we would have tomorrow, Reformation, because Islam is there. It is in the text. It is in the the life and the Sunnah of the Prophet, and and his noble companions and all. And what we basically have to see is that how we live that message in our context, in our world today, So when we're talking about these things, we're not talking in terms of changing our religion. We're not talking about changing our text. We're not saying, editing or deleting or adding anything. What we are simply saying, and then we go back to the basics. And the basics is to find the common good for all.
Indeed.
So I hope that you would conclude it with your word wisdom, and then inshallah we'll give it back to Brother Ali to conclude the session, and inshallah we'll be again.
I think you have really articulated the message well, and for me to add anything to that wonderful conclusion that you made in terms of the greater good, and that we need to stand for humanity. For me to add anything would really be like trying to make tayammum after wuzu has already been done. So Dr. Aslam, you have well concluded this.
Maybe the wuzu has become invalid.
So we'll hand this back to Brother Alim to bring this to a close. But truly, I think it's humbling and it's self-reflection that we think about this, and that we cannot remain in our own cocoons, and we need to ensure that this message resonates. And this is our feeble effort to see that we're able to resonate this message across.
I would request you to give a preamble or a glimpse of what we are going to discuss tomorrow in the Reformation, basically.
Basically, the thought process is that, as I say, that unless we have a plan, unless we have a strategy to be able to put forth or implement the concept of sacrifice into something that is practical, then these will remain a matter of speeches and a matter of dreams, as I said. So tomorrow's session is going to be on the basis, and as you rightly said, we are not talking about changing anything. What we are talking about is the idea of reform within ourselves, within our own societies, within individuals, because when Imam Hussein leaves Medina, his words were that, I am leaving to reform the ummah of my grandfather, looking at what had happened to the ummah within 50 years after the passing of the Prophet. So really, it's in that spirit that we continue to say, what is it that we can do to point towards reform, the Islah, because this is the word, the terminology that he used in terms of the Islah. And there's also, a debate that goes on between Islah and Ihya to say, is this a revival? Is this a reform? And so we'll, inshallah, discuss those concepts and the strategy the way forward.
And I think the important thing for our listeners and viewers is that it is not a Sunni project, it is not a Shia project, it is a common project. To understand sacrifice and to understand the Reformation. And Brother Alim, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Aslam, and thank you, Dr. Walji, for that illuminating discussion on sacrifice and giving us also a preamble of the reform discussion that you both will be engaging in tomorrow. I'd also like to thank all of the viewers who joined us today. And just to give you a little bit more information about what's coming next, I will share with you the schedule that we have over here. So on the 11th, we will have Dr. Ahmadullah Siddiqui. He will be talking about reformation and sacrifice in the context of Muslim Americans. And then he is a professor emeritus of journalism and public relations at Western Illinois University. On the 13th, we're going to have a small change over here. Dr. Mehjabeen Dahla, who's at the Graduate Theological Union, she will be speaking on the 13th, and Professor Inamul Haq from Elmhurst University will be speaking on August 12th. And then we also have a slight change. Instead of Dr. Liaquat Taqeem, we have with us Dr. Barkat Charania. He's a surgeon, lawyer, and author, and a chairman of the advisory board at Ibn Sina Foundation. So he'll be speaking on the 14th. Then we'll also have Hafiz Ikhlas from the Muslim Education Center Mosque in Illinois. We have with us Dr. Hussein Kamala from Hartford Seminary, talking about violence in America. Imam Musa Azam talking about Islamic values and our responsibilities. He's also from Chicago. And then we'll conclude with Dr. Hassan Abbas from the Near East and South Asia Strategic Studies Center. He'll be talking about how Shias and Sunnis can be working together. So
I think it's worth mentioning that Professor Inam al-Haq will speak on the 12th, I think.
Yes, I did mention that. So it's switched.
Okay. Yes.
So inshallah, we're looking forward to this session and your engagement with all of our guest speakers. And we pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us barakah in these sessions and give us the guidance of how we're supposed to understand our religion and how we're supposed to practice our religion. With that, I'll ask Dr. Walji to conclude with a dua.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ya Allah, Ya Rahman, Ya Rahim. Ya Muqallib al-Qulub. Thabit qalbi ala dinik. Birahmatika Ya Rahman Rahim.
Thank you very much. Salam to everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.